I am Cristóbal Colón, though you know me as Christopher Columbus. Let me tell you how a weaver's son from Genoa came to reshape the known world, though not in the way I had intended. The story begins in the narrow streets of Genoa, where the smell of salt air and the tales of sailors filled my childhood dreams. Born in 1451, I was the son of Domenico Colombo, a wool weaver and merchant, and Susanna Fontanarossa. Our family was neither rich nor poor. We lived above my father's shop in the merchants' quarter, where the constant flow of traders and sailors brought stories from across the Mediterranean. From my earliest years, I watched the great ships come and go, listening to tales of distant lands and mysterious islands lying far in the ocean sea. My education was practical rather than formal. While learning my father's trade of wool weaving, I spent every free moment at the docks, absorbing the knowledge that would shape my destiny. Mathematics I learned for navigation, languages I picked up from traders, and geography I studied through the stories of seasoned captains. The merchants of Genoa taught me as much as any university could have: the art of negotiation, the importance of careful observation, and the complexities of trade. By 14, I was already at sea, making short voyages along the Italian coast. Seasickness nearly ended my maritime career before it began, but determination won out over nausea. Each voyage taught me something new: how to read the winds and currents, use the compass and charts, navigate by the stars, and most importantly, how to lead men on the unpredictable seas. The Mediterranean was my first great teacher. I sailed with various merchants throughout my teens and early 20s, learning every aspect of seamanship. We carried wool and wine between Genoa and Corsica, olive oil to England, and precious cargoes to the far corners of the known world. Pirates were a constant threat. I learned to fight as well as sail, skills that would serve me well in later years. Let me tell you about the pivotal moment that brought me to Portugal. In 1476, our ship was attacked by pirates off Cape St. Vincent. The battle ended with our vessel burning, forcing me to swim 6 miles to the Portuguese coast using a wooden oar for flotation. Some would call this disaster. I saw it as divine providence guiding me to the country that would shape my destiny. Portugal in the 1470s was the centre of maritime exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator had established a navigation school at Sagres, gathering the best maps, instruments, and knowledge. Though he was dead by then, his spirit of discovery dominated Portuguese ambitions. Their caravels pushed south along the African coast, seeking a route to the Indies. Here, among the most advanced mariners of the age, my grand idea began to take shape. My marriage to Felipa Moniz Perestrello proved crucial to my ambitions. Her father had been a navigator for Prince Henry, and through her family, I gained access to maps, charts, and ship's logs that spoke of lands far to the west. Living on Porto Santo in the Madeiras, I studied these documents obsessively, developing the idea that would consume the rest of my life. The notion of reaching Asia by sailing west wasn't original. Others had suggested it before, but I became convinced it was possible based on my calculations, though these would prove wildly optimistic. I believed the world was smaller than commonly thought, that Japan lay only 3,000 miles west of the Canaries. I was wrong about the distance, but this error would lead to an even greater discovery. My ideas were shaped by extensive reading and correspondence with learned men. Paolo Toscanelli, a renowned Florentine mathematician, encouraged my Western plans. Marco Polo's accounts of Cipangu and Cathay fired my imagination. Pierre Dailly's Imago Mundi suggested a smaller Earth circumference than reality. I filled my copies of these books with notes, building my case for a Western route to Asia. Religion played a crucial role in my thinking. I saw myself as an instrument of divine will, chosen to carry Christ's message across the ocean sea. The prophecies of Isaiah seemed to speak directly to my mission. I would later write that the discovery of the Western route would provide riches for a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem. For years, I tried to gain support for my plan in Portugal. King John II's experts rejected my calculations as flawed. They were right, though none of us knew about the continent that lay between Europe and Asia. Some say the king secretly sent ships to test my theory, but they turned back before finding land. My frustration grew as I watched Portugal continue its African explorations. The death of Filipe changed everything. With my young son Diego, I left Portugal for Spain in 1485, seeing new opportunity in the unified kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Ferdinand and Isabella were completing their reconquest of Spain from the Moors. Surely they would be interested in expanding Christian influence across the ocean sea. Would you hear how I finally gained royal support for my voyage? How persistence and providence combined to launch the greatest voyage of discovery in human history. The story becomes both grander and more complex from here. Remember, as I tell this tale, that I was driven by a combination of practical experience, scholarly study, religious conviction, and unshakable self-belief. Whether divine providence or simple stubbornness, something would not let me abandon my dream of finding a western route to Asia. Spain in 1485 seemed ripe for my grand proposal. Ferdinand and Isabella were nearing the end of their war against the Moors. Surely they would seek new ventures to extend Christian influence. Yet I would spend 7 years trying to convince them. Years that tested every ounce of my patience and determination. My first audience came through Alonso de Quintanilla, who became fascinated by my plans. He arranged for me to present my case to Fernando de Talavera, the Queen's confessor. The meeting was a disaster. Talavera and his commission of scholars dismissed my calculations as flawed. They were right about the distances. I had severely underestimated the Earth's circumference, but wrong about the possibility of Western lands. Life during these years of waiting was difficult. My brother Bartholomew ran a cartography shop in Seville where I sometimes worked, making maps and charts to support myself and young Diego. The work kept me close to my maritime dreams while providing bare sustenance. Some nights we barely had enough to eat, yet I refused to abandon my vision. The Duke of Medina Sidonia briefly showed interest in financing my voyage privately, then withdrew. The Duke of Medina Celi actually agreed to sponsor me, but was forbidden by the crown. Such voyages of discovery were royal prerogatives. Each rejection only strengthened my resolve. Let me tell you about meeting Beatriz Enriquez de Arana in Cordoba. Though we never married, she gave me my second son, Fernando, and provided emotional support through these trying years. She came from a respectable but modest family, and our relationship caused some scandal. Yet she believed in my dreams when few others did. The Franciscan monastery of La Rabida proved crucial to my cause. The prior, Juan Perez, had been Queen Isabella's confessor. He was impressed by my knowledge of scripture and prophecy, seeing my voyage as a means of spreading Christianity. His influence finally got me another royal audience. My terms were bold, perhaps arrogant. I demanded to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Governor of any lands discovered, and 1/10 of all wealth obtained. Many thought these demands outrageous from a foreign commoner, but I believed in my destiny and would not accept less. The siege of Granada consumed the monarch's attention and resources. Yet even this worked in my favour. I followed the royal court through its campaigns, keeping my proposal alive, making influential friends. When Granada finally fell in January 1492, Queen Isabella was ready to seriously consider my plans. Luis de Santangel, the royal treasurer, proved to be my greatest advocate. When Isabella initially rejected my terms as too expensive, he argued that the potential rewards far outweighed the risks. He even offered to help finance the voyage. His intervention finally convinced the Queen. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed in April 1492, granted everything I had demanded. After 7 years of rejection and ridicule, I had my royal commission. Now came the harder task, finding ships and crews willing to sail into the unknown. Preparing the expedition proved almost as challenging as getting royal approval. The port of Palos, had been ordered to provide 2 ships as penalty for some offence against the crown. But finding crews was another matter. Few experienced sailors wanted to venture into the ocean sea, where legends spoke of boiling waters and fearsome monsters. The Pinzon brothers changed everything. Martin Alonso and Vicente Yanez were respected shipowners in Palos, experienced captains who knew how to gather crews. Their involvement gave the expedition credibility. Without them, I might never have left port. Martin Alonso, especially, helped recruit sailors and invested his own money in the venture. Let me tell you about my 3 ships. The Santa Maria, my flagship, was a carrack, larger but slower than the others. The Pinta and Niña were caravels, faster and more maneuverable. Each had its strengths and weaknesses. The Santa Maria could carry more supplies, but drew too much water for coastal exploration, while the caravels could navigate shallow waters, but had less room for provisions. We departed Palos on August 3rd, 1492, before sunrise, carrying enough supplies for a year. My private estimate was that we'd reach Japan in about 30 days. The crew didn't know this. I kept 2 logs, one showing shorter distances to keep them from losing heart. Even so, fear and uncertainty plagued many of the men. Our first stop at the Canary Islands proved crucial. The Pinta's rudder had been sabotaged before leaving Palos, some crew members hoping to abort the voyage. We spent nearly a month making repairs and taking on fresh supplies. I knew these islands were our last shore landmark before entering completely unknown waters. On September 6th, we sailed west from Gomera into the open ocean. No ship had ever deliberately sailed so far west into the ocean sea. The men's fears grew as familiar stars sank behind us and new ones appeared. The compass began behaving strangely, what we now know as magnetic variation, adding to their unease. The consistency of the northeast trade winds worried the crew. How would we sail home if the winds always blew west? I assured them the winds would change further north, though privately I shared their concern. We were truly entering unknown waters, where all our experience might prove useless. By early October, signs of land increased, floating vegetation, birds flying west, even a carved stick, but still no land appeared. The crew's patience wore thin. Stories tell of a near mutiny, though this is exaggerated. These were experienced sailors who understood that returning was as dangerous as continuing. We had gone too far to turn back without supplies. On October 11th, the signs became unmistakable. A green branch with fresh berries floated by. Birds circled more frequently. At 10 o'clock that night, I saw a light in the distance, dim, moving, like a candle bobbing up and down. I called Pedro Gutierrez to verify I wasn't imagining it. At 2 a.m. on October 12th, Rodrigo de Triana aboard the Pinta shouted the words we had dreamed of hearing. Tierra, tierra. Dawn on October 12th, 1492, revealed a flat island covered in green vegetation. I named it San Salvador, Holy Saviour, though its native inhabitants called it Guanahani. Dressed in full admiral's regalia, carrying the royal standard of Castile and Leon, I went ashore with a party including the Pinzon brothers. We knelt, kissed the earth, and claimed the land for Spain. The people who greeted us were unlike any I had seen. Naked, painted, innocently friendly. I called them Indians, convinced we had reached the outlying islands of Asia. They wore small gold ornaments that immediately caught my attention. Through gestures, they indicated that gold could be found on other islands, particularly one they called Colba, Cuba. Let me tell you about those first weeks of exploration. Everything was new. The plants, the birds, even the air itself seemed different. The natives paddled between islands in canoes, hollowed from single trees larger than any in Europe. They lived in villages of conical houses and seemed to have no concept of private property or weapons of war. I wrote in my journal that they would make excellent servants and could easily be converted to Christianity. The search for gold drove my explorations. We visited several islands, always asking about gold through signs and the few words we learned. The natives kept pointing south and west. On October 28th, we reached Cuba, which I was convinced was part of the Asian mainland, perhaps Japan or China itself. The lush landscape seemed to match Marco Polo's descriptions of Chipangu. Martin Alonso Pinzon's desertion with the Pinta in November dealt our expedition a serious blow. The fastest ship and one of our most experienced captains gone, possibly to claim discoveries for himself. This betrayal would have serious consequences later, though at the time I could only continue exploring with my remaining 2 vessels. Hispaniola, which we reached in December, seemed the most promising land yet. The local cacique, chief, Guacanagari, welcomed us warmly. Gold was more abundant here, and the climate and landscape reminded me of Spain. I began to envision colonies, trade posts, and the conversion of these gentle people to Christianity. Disaster struck on Christmas Eve. While I slept, the Santa Maria, under command of a cabin boy, drifted onto a reef and was wrecked. We managed to salvage most of her cargo, but I now had only the tiny Niña. Guacanagari's people helped us recover what we could, showing such honesty that hardly a thing was taken despite their fascination with our goods. This wreck forced a fateful decision. The Niña couldn't carry all our men home. With Guacanagari's permission and help, I established a small colony called La Navidad, leaving behind 39 men with instructions to find gold, maintain good relations with the natives, and await my return. In my absence, they were to be led by Diego de Arena, a trusted friend and relative of Beatriz. The decision to establish La Navidad would haunt me. I carefully selected the men to stay behind, choosing those with useful skills: a carpenter, a caulker, a physician, and several craftsmen. I left them with strict instructions: build a fort, explore for gold, learn the native languages, and above all, maintain peace with the indigenous people who had shown us such kindness. The Niña departed on January 4th, 1493. 2 days later, we miraculously encountered the Pinta. Martin Alonso Pinzon claimed he had been separated by bad weather, but his men told a different story. He had deliberately sailed away to seek gold for himself. I concealed my anger, knowing I needed his ship and experience for the return voyage. Let me tell you about that return journey, for it tested everything I knew as a sailor. We attempted to follow a more northerly route home, but violent storms nearly destroyed both vessels. The Pinta disappeared again in one storm, and I feared all our discoveries would be lost if we sank. I wrote a detailed account of our voyage, sealed it in a barrel, and threw it overboard, hoping it would reach the Spanish monarchs if we perished. The storms forced us to seek refuge in the Portuguese Azores. Here we faced new dangers. The Portuguese authorities, suspicious of our activities, briefly imprisoned half my crew. Only my diplomatic skills and royal credentials secured their release, but worse was to come. Another storm drove us into the port of Lisbon itself. King John II of Portugal, the same king who had rejected my proposal years earlier, now required me to report my discoveries. It was a delicate situation. Portugal claimed exclusive rights to the eastern route to Asia. If they believed I had reached Asia from the west, they might try to claim my discoveries or even prevent my return to Spain. I walked a careful line in Lisbon, revealing enough to satisfy the king's curiosity while keeping crucial details secret. The Portuguese courtiers were furious that Spain had apparently succeeded where they had refused to venture. Some even suggested to the king that I should be killed to keep the route secret. But John II, whatever his faults, was too honourable for such treachery. The Pinta, it turned out, had been blown to the Bay of Biscay and reached Spain before us. Martin Alonso Pinzon had rushed to Barcelona to report to the monarchs first, but they refused to see him without me. His ambition thwarted, he died shortly after. Some say of shame and disappointment, others of illness contracted in the Indies. Our arrival in Palos on March 15th, 1493 was triumphant. Bells rang, shops closed, and the entire town celebrated. The impossible had been achieved. We had sailed west into the unknown, and returned with proof of lands no European had seen before. More importantly, I had detailed charts showing the route, ensuring Spanish dominance over these new discoveries. My reception at the Spanish court in Barcelona exceeded all expectations. I entered the city in triumph, displaying native Taínos, colourful parrots, exotic plants, and gold ornaments. Ferdinand and Isabella received me standing, a rare honour, and made me sit in their presence while I described my discoveries. The courtiers who had once mocked me now sought my favour. This second voyage would be different from the first. Instead of 3 small ships and 90 men, I commanded a fleet of 17 ships carrying 1,200 people. This was no mere exploration, but a mission of colonization. We carried livestock, seeds, building materials, everything needed to establish a permanent Spanish presence in the Indies. The composition of this expedition would prove problematic. Unlike the skilled sailors of the first voyage, many were nobles seeking quick riches and glory. They expected to find the cities of Asia, with gold paving the streets. Instead, they would face hard work in a tropical climate they weren't prepared for. Their disappointment would turn to resentment. Let me tell you about returning to La Navidad in November 1493. As we approached at night, we fired cannons, expecting a response from our settlers. Only silence answered. By morning, we found disaster. The fort burned, our men dead, the friendly natives gone. Guacanagari told us how the settlers had fought among themselves, abused native women, and been killed by a rival chief named Caonabo. I established a new settlement called La Isabela about 70 miles east. It seemed a better location. Good harbour, a fertile soil, closer to reported gold sources. But the site proved unhealthy. Disease struck quickly in the tropical heat. Men died from fever, dysentery, and strange ailments we had no cure for. The nobles refused to work, though shelter and fortifications were desperately needed. The search for gold consumed us. I led expeditions into the interior of Hispaniola, while my brother Diego managed the growing settlement. We found evidence of gold in the rivers, but not the rich mines I had promised the crown. The natives spoke of mountains containing much gold, but reaching them proved difficult through the dense forests and rough terrain. Controlling my own people proved harder than managing the natives. The hidalgos, noble-born settlers, considered physical labour beneath them. Food became scarce as planted crops failed and supplies dwindled. Disease continued to spread. Some tried to seize ships and return to Spain. I responded with harsh discipline, which only increased resentment.